Throughout history, there have been figures whose cruelty reached such extremes that they left behind trails of blood, terror, and destruction comparable to, or even worse than, those caused by wars. While history books often focus on heroes, revolutions, and moments of progress, there's another side rarely explored in depth: the reigns of the most ruthless tyrants ever known. These individuals weren't merely authoritarian or corrupt. They actively pursued policies that caused mass suffering and death, often under the pretense of ideology, nationalism, or control. Some claimed to fight for justice or progress, while others sought personal power or revenge. Yet they all shared one horrifying trait: an absolute disregard for human life. This story doesn't revolve around abstract ideas or politics. It's about numbers. Real, verifiable, spine-chilling numbers. It's a journey through the darkest corridors of human history, a look at 15 men whose hands are stained with the blood of millions. Their regimes transformed cities into graveyards and countries into vast prisons, where fear ruled and mercy was extinguished. From Africa to Asia, from Europe to the Americas, their names became synonymous with cruelty and inhumanity. And while their motives varied, ranging from racial superiority to revolutionary zeal, the outcome was always the same: unimaginable death tolls and scars that history can never fully erase. Let's begin this grim list with one of the most feared figures in East Africa, Idi Amin, infamously dubbed the Butcher of Uganda. His reign from 1971 to 1979 marked one of the bloodiest periods in African post-colonial history. A former soldier trained by the British colonial army, Amin was physically imposing, known for his deceptive charm and iron discipline. But beneath the uniform and smile hid a man without conscience. After seizing power in a coup d'état that ousted President Milton Obote, Amin declared himself Uganda's absolute ruler. At first, some viewed him as a liberator, a charismatic leader with a nationalist agenda. But the hopeful facade quickly disintegrated as Amin revealed his true nature. He expelled over 60,000 Asians from the country, crushed political opposition, and implemented state-sponsored terror. Victims vanished overnight, dismembered bodies floated down the Nile, a grim reminder of his merciless regime. Doctors, intellectuals, and religious leaders were targeted, and institutions collapsed under the weight of fear and violence. Supported militarily by the Soviet bloc, Amin's forces carried out mass executions and brutal purges. Whispers of cannibalism surfaced, rumors never confirmed, yet disturbingly plausible. By the time Tanzanian forces overthrew him in 1979, an estimated 500,000 Ugandans had lost their lives. Idi Amin fled into exile, unpunished, leaving behind a shattered nation soaked in blood and silence. Next on the list is a man often portrayed as a revolutionary hero, but whose legacy is steeped in terror and systematic violence: Vladimir Lenin. Remembered as the architect of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and the founder of the Soviet Union, Lenin's image has often been softened by ideological nostalgia. However, behind the theoretical brilliance and political rhetoric was a leader who believed in achieving utopia through destruction. From the moment he seized power, Lenin made it clear that the old order had to be eliminated completely. The establishment of the Gulag system, a vast network of labor camps, began under his rule. These camps weren't merely prisons, they were instruments of repression, designed to crush dissent and punish anyone who challenged the new communist state. Political rivals, independent farmers, religious groups, ethnic minorities, and even former supporters were rounded up and sent away without fair trial. One of the earliest and most brutal campaigns was against the Don Cossacks, labeled enemies of the people. More than 700,000 were slaughtered in what was essentially an ethnic cleansing operation. Another dark episode came with the crushing of the Tambov Rebellion, where peasants protesting forced grain seizures were executed en masse. when sailors at the Kronstadt naval base demanded democratic reforms within socialism, they too were annihilated. Under Lenin's leadership, starvation, mass arrests, and extrajudicial killings became state policy. The Red Terror wasn't a deviation from communism. It was its foundation, meticulously constructed by its founder. Despite the horrors committed under his command, Lenin's reputation remains complex. Some still idolize him as a visionary, ignoring the rivers of blood that flowed during his rise to power. The numbers speak clearly. Over 1 million people died due to policies enacted directly or indirectly by Lenin's regime. This figure includes victims of famine, purges, and state-sanctioned murder. The gulags filled quickly, and so did the cemeteries. What makes Lenin's crimes particularly chilling is the cold, calculated nature in which they were carried out. These weren't spontaneous acts of chaos or civil war casualties. They were deliberate measures embedded in the governance structure of the newborn Soviet state. Lenin established the secret police, Cheka, legitimized political repression, and institutionalized violence as a mechanism for maintaining power. His leadership taught successors that fear was more effective than persuasion, and that ideology could justify even the most inhumane acts. Even after suffering a series of strokes that left him partially incapacitated, Lenin continued to influence Soviet policy until his death. His successors would adopt and expand his model of state terror, refining it into an even deadlier machine. Lenin's true legacy isn't just a revolution, it's a manual for dictatorship, where ideals become weapons and dissent is met with annihilation. And while history moved on, the template he created would be used again and again by tyrants far and wide. Following in the shadow of revolutionary turmoil, Yakubu Gowon emerged in Nigeria during a time of immense tension and uncertainty. At just 32 years old, Gowon ascended to power after a series of coups in the 1960s. Nigeria, newly independent and brimming with potential, quickly devolved into ethnic division and violent conflict. The spark that ignited the bloodshed came when the southeastern region, dominated by the Igbo ethnic group, declared independence as the Republic of Biafra. Rather than negotiate or seek compromise, Gowon responded with overwhelming force. The Nigerian Civil War, often referred to as the Biafran War, became one of the most brutal internal conflicts in post-colonial Africa. Over a span of 3 years, Gowon's military strategy included aerial bombardments, scorched earth tactics, and an infamous blockade that cut off all food and medical supplies to Biafra. The world watched in horror as images of skeletal children with distended bellies emerged from the region, emblems of a manufactured famine. For Gowon, starvation was not collateral damage, it was a weapon. It is estimated that more than 1 million civilians died from hunger, while another 100,000 soldiers perished in combat. The conflict left the region devastated, with social, cultural, and economic wounds that have never fully healed. Despite this, Gowon was not overthrown for his crimes, but instead by yet another coup in 1975. He would go on to live, freely shielded from justice, while countless families grieved in silence for a generation lost to hunger and bullets. As Africa struggled with its post-independence nightmares, Ethiopia fell into the grip of Mengistu Haile Mariam, a military leader who promised reform but delivered only death. Mengistu rose to power following the fall of Emperor Haile Selassie, heading a Marxist military junta known as the Derg. His reign, which began in 1977, was marked by sweeping ideological purges and one of the most infamous political crackdowns in African history, the Red Terror. Under Mengistu's command, the streets of Addis Ababa became open-air morgues. Every morning, bodies were found scattered across sidewalks, bullet holes in their chests, and signs reading, "Enemy of the People," pinned to them. The victims were often young students, teachers, religious leaders, and anyone perceived as a threat to the regime. Families were forced to pay for the bullets used to execute their loved ones. A perverse policy meant to humiliate and instill fear. Night raids became routine as security forces dragged people from their homes to be tortured and killed without trial. But political terror was only one facet of Mengistu's rule. His economic policies, including forced collectivization and population displacement, created a man-made famine of staggering proportions. Ethiopia, once seen as the cradle of humanity, became a symbol of despair and suffering. International aid workers captured haunting images of children dying in the dust, their eyes vacant from starvation. The world saw famine, but it was policy. Over 1.5 million people are believed to have died under Mengistu's rule. He eventually fled to Zimbabwe, where he has lived in exile, untouched by courts or consequence. A grim reminder of how impunity often shelters the worst among us. Further east, the Korean peninsula gave rise to one of the most enduring dynasties of totalitarianism the world has ever seen, starting with Kim Il-sung, the founding father of North Korea. Installed in power in 1948 with the backing of the Soviet Union, Kim built an iron-fisted regime that has endured for generations. On the surface, his image was carefully crafted, a benevolent leader, a revolutionary hero, even a godlike figure. But behind the golden statues and orchestrated worship was a system of absolute control and unfathomable repression. From the outset, dissent was outlawed. Those who questioned the government were arrested, tortured, and either executed or sent to sprawling political prison camps. During the Korean War, 1950-1953, Kim's forces conducted mass executions of civilians suspected of aiding the South or the West. Entire villages were wiped out, and thousands were slaughtered as a warning to others. But even after the war ended, the purges and oppression didn't stop. They only intensified. North Korea became a surveillance state, where children were taught to report their parents, and ideology was more important than family. The regime established vast prison systems where inmates, including women, children, and the elderly, were held for generations. Hunger, forced labor, and torture were daily realities. It is estimated that more than 1.6 million people died under Kim Il-sung's rule through starvation, executions, and brutal imprisonment. His successors, Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un, inherited and perfected the machinery of repression he built. North Korea remains a nation frozen in fear, its people trapped in a cage designed by a man who turned his country into both a shrine and a graveyard. While Kim Il-sung used ideology and isolation to enslave his people, Pol Pot of Cambodia pursued a vision so extreme it nearly erased an entire nation. Pol Pot, born Saloth Sar, came to power in 1975 as the leader of the Khmer Rouge following a long civil war. Upon seizing control, he implemented one of the most radical and horrifying social engineering experiments in human history. His goal was to create an agrarian utopia, free of class distinctions, intellectualism, and modernity. To achieve this, he forcibly evacuated entire cities, emptying Phnom Penh within days and sending millions to labor camps in the countryside. Doctors, teachers, engineers, even those who wore glasses, were targeted for execution under the belief that education was a threat to his new world order. Families were separated, and children were indoctrinated to inform on their parents. The countryside turned into a vast network of forced labor camps, where starvation, disease, and exhaustion claimed countless lives. Torture and execution were routine. Victims were bludgeoned to death to save bullets, and their bodies dumped in mass graves now known as the killing fields. Between 1975 and 1979, nearly 2.5 million Cambodians, approximately a quarter of the population, died. This wasn't war, it was self-inflicted genocide. A country was hollowed out from within by a man who believed he was saving it Pol Pot fled into the jungle when Vietnam invaded Cambodia, and though he was later captured, he never faced international justice. He died peacefully in 1998, having evaded trial for orchestrating one of the most senseless and devastating genocides of the 20th century. While Pol Pot orchestrated Cambodia's self-destruction, another lesser-known but equally devastating campaign of extermination unfolded under the direction of Ismail Enver, one of the chief architects of the Armenian genocide. A high-ranking officer in the Ottoman Empire and one of the leaders of the Young Turks movement, Enver wielded immense power during World War I, serving as the empire's Minister of War. Following a catastrophic defeat against Russian forces at Sarikamish, Enver, desperate to deflect blame, targeted the Armenian population, an ethnic and religious minority accused of collaborating with the enemy. What began as suspicion soon escalated into full-scale annihilation. Enver ordered the deportation of Armenian men who were executed en masse, while women, children and the elderly were forced into brutal death marches through the Syrian desert. Starvation, exposure and systematic killings claimed hundreds of thousands of lives along the way. Those who survived the journey were placed in concentration camps with inhumane conditions. But the atrocities weren't confined to Armenians. Under Enver's command, hundreds of thousands of Greeks and Assyrians were also subjected to extermination in what would become a broader campaign of ethnic cleansing. The total death toll is estimated to be nearly 3 million. 1.2 million Armenians, 830,000 Greeks, and 500,000 Assyrians. The Ottoman Empire attempted to conceal the full scale of the genocide, and Enver fled into exile after the war. He was killed in combat in 1922, never having faced justice. Decades later, the term genocide itself was coined in part to describe the horror he unleashed. And yet, his name remains. Obscured in many history books, a silence as chilling as the crimes themselves. Far removed from the deserts of the Middle East, another figure, celebrated in popular history yet drenched in blood, carved his legacy across continents. Alexander the Great. Hailed as a military genius and a symbol of classical heroism, Alexander's name is etched into history with admiration. But behind the myth lies a darker reality. Born to King Philip II of Macedon and tutored by Aristotle, Alexander inherited a formidable army and an insatiable ambition for conquest. Following his father's assassination, he launched a campaign that stretched from Greece to India, building one of the largest empires in ancient history by the age of 30. However, his empire was not built through diplomacy. It was forged in fire and death. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Thebes was razed, its inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved. The siege of Tyre lasted 7 months and ended with mass crucifixions. In the Indian subcontinent, his troops massacred entire communities, often without provocation. The brutality of his campaigns was so feared that some populations chose mass suicide over the possibility of enslavement and torture. Women were raped, children sold into slavery, temples looted, and cultural legacies obliterated. Historical estimates suggest that over 3.5 million people died as a direct result of his military conquests. These were not incidental casualties. They were the intended outcome of a strategy built on fear and domination. And yet, centuries later, Alexander is celebrated in literature and taught as a model of leadership. Few stop to question the cost of his so-called greatness. Behind the laurels and marble statues lies a trail of suffering that spanned continents. While Alexander's campaigns unfolded in ancient times, the 20th century brought with it a far more structured and industrialized form of terror, one that reached horrifying new heights under Hideki Tojo, the militarist who steered Imperial Japan into the heart of World War II. Unlike many dictators who seized power through force, Tojo climbed the ranks methodically within Japan's military bureaucracy. By 1941, he had become prime minister, combining political command with military authority. His worldview was shaped by a fanatical belief in Japanese supremacy and an uncompromising loyalty to the emperor. Under Tojo's leadership, Japan embarked on a campaign of conquest across East and Southeast Asia. What followed were atrocities that still send shivers down the spine of historians. In the infamous Nanjing Massacre, also known as the Rape of Nanking, Japanese soldiers raped tens of thousands of women and butchered civilians with unfathomable cruelty. Tojo's regime implemented eugenics programs, punished mixed-race families, and transformed schools into centers of militaristic indoctrination. But perhaps the most sinister aspect of his rule was the normalization of brutality, human. Experimentation was carried out by units like the infamous Unit 731, where prisoners were dissected alive or exposed to deadly pathogens in the name of science. Millions perished, not just in combat, but through mass executions, starvation, forced labor, and torture. The total death toll attributed to Tojo's actions is estimated to exceed 5 million. When the war ended, Tojo attempted suicide, but survived. He was later tried and executed for war crimes, but the damage he inflicted left deep scars across Asia. His reign proved that even in the modern age, ideology and obedience could still be weaponized to unleash horrors on an unprecedented scale. While Hideki Tojo's legacy of devastation was rooted in ideology and warfare, King Leopold II of Belgium unleashed an entirely different kind of nightmare, one cloaked in civility and concealed behind the guise of humanitarianism. In the late 19th century, Europe was engulfed in the so-called scramble for Africa, and Leopold, eager to elevate his small kingdom's global standing, devised a plan that would dwarf the greed of his contemporaries. Masquerading as a philanthropist, he created the International African Association, a front for what would become the Congo Free State, a personal colony under his absolute control. Unlike typical colonial ventures, the Congo wasn't governed by Belgium but by Leopold himself, making it his private enterprise. The region, rich in ivory and rubber, became a factory of suffering. Entire villages were enslaved and forced to meet impossible production quotas under the threat of death. Soldiers of the Force Publique enforced order through mutilation and murder. Failure to meet quotas resulted in horrific punishments. Limbs were severed, families killed, and entire communities burned to the ground. Children weren't spared, and women were often held hostage to ensure their husbands' compliance. The infamous image of Congolese children missing hands became the haunting symbol of Leopold's reign. It's estimated that between 10 to 15 million people died due to forced labor, starvation, disease, and direct violence. What makes Leopold's crimes uniquely disturbing is the veneer of legitimacy that surrounded them. He received praise in European courts and portrayed himself as a civilizing force. By the time global outcry forced Belgium to assume official control in 1908, the Congo was a broken land. Leopold died wealthy and unpunished, never having faced justice for the genocide he orchestrated in the name of progress. As the blood-soaked rule of King Leopold II drew global condemnation, another figure in the distant steppes of Central Asia was scripting an even darker chapter in human history. One not of imperial pretense, but of unfiltered violence and domination. His name was Tamerlane, or Timur, a 14th century conqueror who styled himself as the heir to Genghis Khan's legacy. While his ambition echoed that of his Mongol predecessor, Tamerlane's methods were distinctly his own, theatrical, sadistic, and utterly merciless. Born in modern-day Uzbekistan, he rose from tribal warrior to feared military strategist, forging an empire that stretched from India to the Mediterranean. But Tamerlane didn't just conquer, he obliterated. Cities that resisted were turned into open-air tombs. In Baghdad, nearly 90,000 people were executed in a single day. In Delhi, His forces massacred hundreds of thousands, regardless of religion or status. Tamerlane's preferred signature was the construction of pyramids made from the skulls of his victims, erected at the gates of destroyed cities as both warning and symbol of his ruthlessness. Entire populations vanished in the wake of his campaigns, and fields were left littered with corpses, so many that some regions ceased agriculture for generations. Estimates suggest that over 17 million people died as a direct result of his conquests, a staggering number considering the global population at the time. His reign was not driven by ideology, nor justified by religion. It was a reign of terror for the sake of legacy. Tamerlane died in 1405 while planning yet another invasion, this time into China. He was entombed in an ornate mausoleum, remembered by some as a patron of art and architecture. But beneath the marble lies the story of a butcher, not a builder, a man whose thirst for power drowned entire civilizations in blood. In the wake of medieval horrors, the 20th century bore witness to perhaps the most infamous figure of all. Adolf Hitler, the man who turned modernity itself into a tool of genocide. Born in Austria and initially dismissed as a failed artist and disgruntled soldier, Hitler rose to power through a mixture of propaganda, manipulation, and deep-seated grievances left by World War I. Germany's economic collapse and national humiliation provided fertile ground for his extremist ideology. By the time he became Chancellor in 1933, Hitler had already transformed the Nazi Party into a cult of racial purity and vengeance. Once in power, he dismantled democratic institutions, suppressed opposition, and implemented laws that dehumanized Jews, Romani people, homosexuals, disabled individuals, and political dissenters. The Holocaust, Hitler's most monstrous legacy, saw the industrialized extermination of over 6 million Jews through gas chambers, forced labor, starvation, and medical experiments. But the scale of his crimes extended far beyond the concentration camps. World War II, ignited by Hitler's invasions of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, resulted in the deaths of an estimated 17 million people, including millions of civilians across occupied Europe. Towns were leveled, cultures annihilated, and lives extinguished with mechanical precision. Nazi ideology wasn't just about dominance, it was about erasure. Entire populations were targeted for extinction based on ethnicity or ideology. Even as Allied forces closed in, Hitler refused surrender, retreating into a Berlin bunker where he eventually took his own life in 1945. Cowardice marked his end, but the scars of his regime endured. To this day, the swastika remains a symbol of absolute evil, and the term Nazi is synonymous with hatred. Hitler's legacy serves as a warning. When hatred is institutionalized and power is unchecked, civilization itself can become a factory of death. While Adolf Hitler brought mechanized genocide to the heart of Europe, Joseph Stalin orchestrated a quieter but equally deadly campaign of terror within the borders of his own country. After Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin consolidated power with surgical precision, eliminating rivals through purges, show trials, and forced disappearances. But it wasn't bullets alone that built his reign of fear. It was starvation, bureaucracy, and ideology wielded as instruments of annihilation. Determined to transform the Soviet Union into an industrial superpower, Stalin launched a series of brutal economic policies. His collectivization program stripped millions of peasants of their land and forced them into collective farms. Resistance was met with lethal force. In Ukraine, the policy culminated in the Holodomor, a state-engineered famine that claimed the lives of over 4 million people. Food was confiscated, borders sealed, and entire villages left to starve, not because of natural disaster, but because of political will. At the same time, Stalin's Great Purge swept through Soviet society in the late 1930s. No one was safe. party officials, military officers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were accused of treason and executed or sent to labor camps. The gulags, harsh prison colonies scattered across frozen Siberia, became home to millions, many of whom never returned. Torture, starvation, and forced labor became everyday experiences for those within. Stalin rewrote history books, erased people from photographs, and turned fear into the social currency of the USSR. By the time of his death in 1953, it is estimated that more than 30 million people had perished as a result of his policies. Despite this staggering toll, his image remains contested in Russia today, proof that power can rewrite not only history, but morality itself. Even with Stalin's staggering death toll, one man would ultimately surpass him, not with weapons or war, but through ideological fanaticism and a ruthless disregard for human life. That man was Mao Zedong, the founding father of the People's Republic of China. Rising to power in 1949 after a long and bloody civil war, Mao positioned himself as a revolutionary liberator. But the promises of equality and prosperity soon gave way to one of the most catastrophic social experiments in modern history. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, a radical campaign to transform China's agrarian society into an industrialized communist utopia. Millions of peasants were forced into collective farms and ordered to produce steel in backyard furnaces, melting down tools, pots and pans in a futile attempt at progress. Crops were neglected, agricultural data falsified, and local officials terrified of reporting failure. The result was a famine so devastating that entire villages ceased to exist. Starvation became so widespread that some communities resorted to cannibalism. It's estimated that between 20 to 45 million people died during the Great Leap Forward alone. Yet Mao did not stop there. In 1966, he initiated the Cultural Revolution, a nationwide purge of bourgeois elements from Chinese society. Schools closed, books burned, and intellectuals were publicly humiliated, beaten or killed by fervent young followers known as the Red Guards. Temples were razed, families torn apart, and centuries of cultural heritage erased in the name of ideological purity. By the time Mao died in 1976, he had overseen the deaths of up to 78 million people, the highest number attributed to any one individual in human history. Despite the scale of suffering, his portrait still hangs in Tiananmen Square, a chilling reminder of how propaganda can outlive even the most monstrous legacy. The death tolls attributed to Mao Zedong mark the zenith of human loss caused by a single leader. But beyond the numbers lies an even more disturbing reality, the normalization of mass suffering under the guise of revolutionary progress. Mao's policies didn't merely result in death, they destroyed the very fabric of Chinese society. During the Great Leap Forward, entire communities were pitted against each other, encouraged to denounce neighbors and family members for perceived disloyalty to the regime. The fear of being labeled a counter-revolutionary created a toxic culture where silence was survival and truth became dangerous. Parents watched helplessly as their children starved, unable to speak out or seek help. Some were forced to eat bark, dirt, or the corpses of the recently deceased to stay alive. Government officials, terrified of punishment, lied about crop yields, exacerbating the crisis. Meanwhile, Mao remained isolated from the consequences of his own policies, surrounded by sycophants who reinforced his delusions of success. When he launched the Cultural Revolution, he weaponized youth against their elders, effectively dismantling education, governance and culture in one sweeping campaign. Professors were beaten to death in public squares, ancient artifacts and temples were obliterated, and entire schools were transformed into ideological battlegrounds. The Red Guards, once hailed as protectors of revolution, became enforcers of chaos, encouraged to kill in the name of purification. Families were divided, communities shattered, and the collective trauma endured for generations. Mao's ability to mobilize mass violence through charisma and manipulation exemplifies the terrifying potential of unchecked ideological power. His rule wasn't just a failure of policy, it was a systematic dismantling of humanity itself, orchestrated by a man who believed that suffering was a necessary price for utopia. As we step back and examine the magnitude of these atrocities, a chilling pattern emerges, one that transcends geography, time, and ideology. These tyrants didn't merely rule with an iron fist, they reshaped reality to justify their brutality. Whether cloaked in nationalism, communism, imperial ambition, or religious zeal, their regimes thrived on fear, obedience, and absolute control. They silenced dissent, not with arguments, but with death. They didn't build nations, they dismantled them, turning schools into propaganda factories, prisons into death camps, and governments into machines of extermination. Their legacies persist not just in the scars left on their countries, but in the systems of repression they inspired and perfected. For every Stalin or Mao, there were smaller-scale dictators, watching, learning, and mimicking their methods in different corners of the world. What ties these men together is not merely their capacity for violence, but their calculated, strategic use of it to retain power. The chilling efficiency with which they turned policies into instruments of death reveals something far more terrifying than chaos. It reveals order. A deliberate, methodical order designed to erase opposition, breed conformity, and rewrite history. And perhaps the most disturbing truth is how easily many of them escaped justice, dying in comfort or being celebrated posthumously. Some still have statues erected in their honor, their crimes glossed over in schoolbooks or masked by nationalistic pride. The world often moves on, but the victims do not. Their stories linger like whispers across time, reminding us that tyranny doesn't vanish. It evolves, waiting for the next leader willing to cross the threshold into darkness under the pretense of greatness. Despite the overwhelming darkness portrayed in these historical accounts, they are not merely tales of destruction. They are warnings carved into the memory of humanity. Each regime, each tyrant, represents a moment when the world failed to act, when silence gave power to cruelty, and when blind loyalty triumphed over compassion. But amid the horror, there is also resistance. Even in the bleakest of circumstances, individuals stood up, sometimes alone, sometimes in numbers, to defy the machinery of death. Dissidents who risked everything to speak the truth, families who sheltered the hunted, teachers who preserved forbidden knowledge, and victims who, in their final moments, clung to dignity. Their courage didn't always stop the atrocities, but it planted seeds of memory and accountability. Today, scholars, journalists, and survivors continue to shed light on these crimes, refusing to let the dead be forgotten. Their efforts help ensure that future generations do not inherit only the myths of greatness, but understand the full weight of its consequences. Every statue toppled, every truth unveiled, every archive opened is an act of justice, however delayed. The scars left by these tyrants are deep, but they also serve as rallying cries. They remind us that freedom must be defended relentlessly, that power must be questioned constantly, and that history must be told honestly, without romanticism, without censorship, and without fear. In doing so, we not only honor the victims, but we also armor ourselves against the return of such darkness. Because tyranny thrives where memory fails, and it is only through remembrance that we preserve our shared humanity. So, as this journey through history's darkest corners comes to a close, it leaves us with a final, urgent reflection. Power, unchecked and unaccountable, is humanity's greatest threat. These men were not supernatural beings, they were mortal, fallible, and deeply flawed. What made them dangerous was not just their ambitions, but the systems, ideologies, and apathy that allowed them to rise and reign. Each one capitalized on instability, manipulated fear, and built their empires not on hope, but on the corpses of those who opposed them. And yet, history is not only written by the powerful, it is preserved by the survivors, the whistleblowers, the rebels, and the truth-tellers. Their voices, sometimes drowned by propaganda and time, continue to echo in museums, books, courtrooms, and classrooms. They remind us that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, the human spirit can endure, resist, and rise. Again, this narrative, as harrowing as it is, carries a message not of despair, but of responsibility. The responsibility to recognize the signs of emerging tyranny, to protect the vulnerable, and to speak out, even when it's inconvenient or dangerous. In remembering the worst of humanity, we are not paralyzed by fear, but empowered by awareness. Let these stories be more than historical accounts. Let them be fuel for vigilance, for empathy, and for action. Because while evil may wear many faces, history has taught us that silence is its greatest ally, and courage its most formidable enemy.